London, 1810. The chandeliers of Carlton House cast their merciless brilliance upon the highest echelons of English society. Couples swept across the marble floor in choreographed perfection, a sea of jeweled tiaras and military dress coats. Yet at the shadowed periphery near the retiring room, Jane Everleigh stood motionless, a forgotten statue in her mended cotton gown. At 22, Jane had long since accepted her role as the invisible foundation upon which her stepsisters' triumphs were built. Not that anyone would recognize her connection to the two radiant young women currently holding court at the center of the ballroom. The Ashford sisters, Constance and Beatrice, were the toasts of the season. Each recently engaged to an earl, each more luminous than the last in gowns Jane herself had pressed that morning. "Your stepsisters have achieved the impossible," came a brittle voice. Jane turned to find Mrs. Pemberton, her late father's solicitor's widow, observing the spectacle with shrewd eyes. "2 earls in 1 season. Your stepmother must be in raptures." "They have been most fortunate," Jane replied carefully. "Fortune had little to do with it." Mrs. Pemberton's gaze sharpened. "Though I wonder what fortune remains for you, my dear." "The Everleigh estate your father left? The documents were quite clear about your entitlement before his remarriage." A familiar ache settled in Jane's chest. The money was gone then, all of it, spent on her stepsisters' dowries while she held their cloaks. "I see you understand," Mrs. Pemberton continued. "Your stepmother has built her daughter's futures on your inheritance." One inquiry from the right solicitor, one whisper to the Court of Chancery, and this entire glittering facade collapses. Across the ballroom, Jane caught sight of her stepmother, Lady Viola Everleigh, resplendent in emerald silk, laughing with a circle of countesses. At 48, she had perfected the art of social alchemy, transforming her dead husband's orphaned daughter into an unpaid lady's maid while his money purchased coronets for her own blood. "I have no desire to create scandal," Jane said quietly. "Desire or not, you may have no choice." Mrs. Pemberton's voice dropped. "Your stepmother grows bold. She speaks of sending you to her sister's household in Yorkshire as a governess." Before Jane could respond, the orchestra faltered mid-phrase. A ripple of movement swept through the assembly as the crowd parted with collective breathlessness. Every head turned toward the grand entrance. "His Grace, the Duke of Avery," the footman announced, his voice cutting through the sudden, electric silence. Arthur Wellesley, the 6th Duke of Avery, stood framed in the gilded doorway, his presence commanding the room with the same absolute authority he wielded over his vast northern estates. At 31, his reputation preceded him. The most eligible peer in England, the man who had refused every matrimonial scheme for a decade, as unreachable and uncompromising as winter itself. And his eyes, dark and assessing, were scanning the ballroom not for the diamonds at its center, but for something or someone the rest of society had been trained to overlook. The assembly held its collective breath as the Duke descended the marble steps with measured precision. Mothers straightened their daughters' posture. Debutantes arranged their features into expressions of artful indifference. Lady Viola Everleigh positioned Constance and Beatrice directly in his path, their engagement rings catching the candlelight like calculated bait. Jane pressed herself further into the shadows, instinctively retreating as she had learned to do. Invisibility was safety. Silence was survival. "Jane!" Beatrice's voice cut across the room with the sharpness of breaking glass. "Jane, come here at once!" Every eye in the vicinity turned. Jane felt the familiar burn of exposure, the weight of 100 curious gazes cataloging her plain gown, her unadorned hair, her complete lack of consequence. She moved through the crowd like a ghost navigating the living, keeping her eyes downcast. When she reached her stepsister, Beatrice thrust a silk shawl into her hands without looking at her. "This clasp is broken. I cannot possibly dance with Lord Asherton while dragging this about. Take it to the retiring room and repair it immediately." "Of course." Jane accepted the garment, her fingers automatically assessing the damage. A simple fix, the clasp had merely come loose from its mooring. "And Jane," Constance added, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "do try not to look quite so much like a governess. You're embarrassing us." Laughter rippled through the nearby listeners. Jane felt the familiar constriction in her throat, the practiced numbness that allowed her to endure such moments. She turned to leave, and walked directly into an immovable wall of superfine wool and masculine warmth. The shawl tumbled from her grasp. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her before she could fall. Jane looked up and up into the coldest, most penetrating gray eyes she had ever seen. The Duke of Avery. Time suspended itself. The ballroom receded into a blur of shocked faces and frozen motion. Jane could hear nothing but the thundering of her own heartbeat, could feel nothing but the Duke's hands on her shoulders, firm and strangely gentle. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not see." "No," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her very bones. "No one ever does." There was something in those 4 words, some quality of recognition that made Jane's breath catch. He was not speaking of her collision. He was speaking of her. The Duke released her shoulders, but did not step away. Instead, he bent with fluid grace and retrieved Beatrice's fallen shawl, examining the broken clasp with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Your Grace?" Lady Viola's voice rang out with forced gaiety as she materialized beside them, Constance and Beatrice flanking her like well-trained soldiers. "What an unexpected pleasure. May I present my daughters, Miss Constance Ashford and Miss Beatrice Ashford, though I believe you may have already made their acquaintance at Lady Pemberton's musicale." The Duke's expression remained impassive. He did not acknowledge the introduction. His gaze remained fixed on Jane, with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "And this," Lady Viola continued, her tone shifting to something dismissive and cold, "is merely Jane. She assists with the household. Pay her no mind, Your Grace. She is quite clumsy, I'm afraid, always underfoot." "Is she?" It was not a question. The Duke's voice had gone dangerously soft. He extended his hand, not to Constance, not to Beatrice, but to Jane. The assembly gasped. Somewhere, a champagne flute shattered against marble. "Miss Everleigh," the Duke said, and the use of her proper name felt like a benediction, a public acknowledgement of her existence. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" The world tilted on its axis. Jane stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a mythical creature, something that could not possibly exist in her reality. "Your Grace?" Lady Viola sputtered. "Surely you meant to ask." "I meant," the Duke interrupted, his eyes never leaving Jane's face, "to ask Miss Jane Everleigh. I do not misspeak." The entire ballroom had gone silent. 300 people watched as the most powerful Duke in England waited for the answer of the poorest girl in the room. Jane looked at his hand, then at his face, and saw, beneath the ice and aristocratic composure, something she recognized: loneliness. The particular isolation of being perpetually observed, yet never truly seen. She placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers with unexpected warmth. and as he led her onto the dance floor, Jane heard the whispers erupt like wildfire. But for the first time in her life, she did not care. The Duke of Avery had seen her, and nothing would ever be the same. The morning after the Carlton House ball, the Everleigh household erupted into controlled chaos. Lady Viola had spent the night conducting a furious post-mortem of the Duke's inexplicable behavior, her conclusions growing more elaborate with each retelling. By dawn, she had settled on a narrative that satisfied her. The Duke had merely been testing the quality of the family's breeding by dancing with the poorest specimen. His true interest would reveal itself today, when he called upon Constance or Beatrice to formalize his intentions. "He will come before noon," Lady Viola announced over breakfast, gesturing for the footman to rearrange the flowers in the drawing room for the third time. "A man of his consequence does not dance with a girl in public without intending to follow proper protocol. Constance, you will wear the rose silk. Beatrice, the blue morning dress with the Belgian lace. We must present a united front of elegance and refinement." Jane, who had been dismissed to the kitchen to oversee the preparation of refreshments, listened to these pronouncements with the same detached observation she might give to a stage play. The Duke would not come. Men like Arthur Wellesley did not pursue girls like her. The dance had been an aberration, perhaps a momentary impulse born of pity or perverse amusement. By this afternoon, it would be forgotten. She was elbow-deep in arranging hothouse strawberries when the knocker sounded. The entire household froze. Mrs. Hewitt, the housekeeper, exchanged a meaningful glance with Jane before hurrying toward the entrance hall. Through the kitchen door, left deliberately ajar, Jane could hear Lady Viola's sharp intake of breath, the rustle of silk as Constance and Beatrice positioned themselves artfully on the settee. "His Grace, the Duke of Avery," the footman announced, his voice cracking slightly with the weight of the pronouncement. Jane's hands stilled on the strawberries. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. "Your Grace." Lady Viola's voice dripped with calculated warmth. "What an extraordinary pleasure. Please do come in. May I offer you refreshment? Tea, perhaps? We have just received a shipment of the most exquisite Darjeeling from—" "I have not come for tea." The Duke's voice cut through Lady Viola's performance with surgical precision. "I have come to speak with Miss Jane Everleigh." The silence that followed was so complete that Jane could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second falling like a hammer blow. "Jane?" Lady Viola's laugh was brittle, artificial. "Your Grace, surely there has been some misunderstanding. Jane is not, that is, she does not receive. She is merely a dependent in this household. A charity case left to us by my late husband's misguided sense of, 'Where is she?' 2 words, spoken with such absolute authority that Jane felt them reverberate through the floorboards. She stood, her hands trembling as she removed her apron. Mrs. Hewitt appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expression caught between concern and something that might have been hope. "You don't have to go," the housekeeper whispered. "I can tell him you're indisposed." But Jane was already moving, drawn forward by a force she could not name. She smoothed her plain gray morning dress, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and stepped into the drawing room. The Duke stood in the center of the space like a dark pillar of contained power, his greatcoat still buttoned, his expression carved from granite. He had not sat. He had not removed his gloves. This was not a social call. His eyes found hers immediately, and Jane saw something flicker in their depths, recognition, perhaps, or relief. "Miss Everleigh." He inclined his head with a respect that no one had ever shown her in this house. "Your Grace." Jane managed a curtsy, acutely aware of Lady Viola's mounting fury, of Constance and Beatrice's matching expressions of outraged disbelief. I have come on a matter of business." The Duke withdrew a leather portfolio from inside his coat, extracting a document with practiced efficiency. "Lady Viola, I believe you are familiar with the circumstances of your late husband's estate?" Lady Viola's face had gone pale beneath her rouge. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Your Grace. My husband's affairs were settled years ago." "Were they?" The Duke's tone suggested otherwise. "Because according to the records held by my solicitors, who, I should mention, also served as trustees for certain investments made by the late Mr. Everleigh, there remains an outstanding debt. A considerable debt." He placed the document on the side table with deliberate care. Jane caught sight of her father's signature at the bottom, the familiar loops and flourishes that she had not seen since childhood. "This is preposterous," Lady Viola sputtered. "My husband owed nothing to—" "Your husband borrowed £15,000 from the Avery estate to finance a trading venture in 1805. The loan was to be repaid within 5 years with interest. That deadline passed 3 years ago. The current sum owed, with accumulated interest, stands at £22,000. The color drained entirely from Lady Viola's face. Constance gripped Beatrice's hand, their carefully cultivated composure crumbling. £22,000. It was a fortune. It was ruin. "There must be some mistake," Lady Viola whispered. "We haven't the means to. The estate is entailed. The funds are—" "Spent," the Duke finished. "Yes, I am aware. 2 dowries for 2 Earls' sons do not come cheaply. Which brings me to the purpose of my visit." He turned, and his gaze settled on Jane with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I am prepared to forgive the debt in its entirety. I will require no repayment, no forfeiture of property or assets. The Everleigh name will remain unblemished. Your daughter's marriages secure." Lady Viola's expression transformed from terror to desperate hope. "Your Grace, your generosity is—" "In exchange," the Duke continued, his eyes never leaving Jane's face, "for Miss Jane Everleigh's hand in marriage." The room exploded. Constance shrieked. Beatrice collapsed against the settee in a dramatic swoon. Lady Viola's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, no sound emerging. But Jane heard none of it. She stood frozen, staring at the Duke of Avery, trying to comprehend what he had just said. Marriage. To her. In exchange for a debt she had never known existed. "This is madness," Lady Viola finally managed. "Jane is nobody, nothing. She has no dowry, no connections, no—" "She has my interest," the Duke said quietly, "which is more than sufficient." He crossed the room to stand before Jane, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Up close, she could see that his eyes were not merely gray, but contained flecks of silver, like winter ice catching starlight. "Miss Everleigh," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I realize this is highly irregular. I am not a man given to romantic gestures or flowery speeches. But I observed something in you last night, a quality of character that is exceedingly rare in my experience. I am in need of a wife, not an ornament for my arm or a strategic alliance, but a partner. Someone with intelligence, dignity, and the strength to withstand the considerable pressures of my position." He paused, and something almost vulnerable crossed his features. "I believe you possess these qualities. I am asking if you would consent to become my Duchess. You need not answer immediately, but I should warn you. Your stepmother's financial situation is quite dire. Without this arrangement, she faces debtor's prison within the month." Jane's mind reeled. This could not be happening. Dukes did not propose to penniless orphans in drawing rooms on Tuesday mornings. They did not offer to erase family debts in exchange for girls in gray dresses with calloused hands. And yet he stood before her, waiting, his expression betraying nothing but a carefully controlled hope. "Why me?" Jane whispered. "Truly?" The Duke's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Because you did not look at me the way they do." He gestured almost imperceptibly toward her stepsisters. "You looked at me as if I were simply a man. It has been a very long time since anyone has done that." Behind him, Lady Viola had begun to recover, her calculating mind already working through the implications. A duchess. Jane, a duchess. It was absurd, impossible, and yet the debt would be erased. The scandal averted. Her daughter's position secured. "Jane will accept," Lady Viola announced, her voice sharp with decision. "Of course she will accept. It is a most generous offer, Your Grace. Most generous indeed." But the Duke did not turn. His eyes remained locked on Jane's, waiting for her answer. Not her stepmother's, hers. Jane thought of Yorkshire, of governess positions and a lifetime of invisibility. She thought of her father's lost estate, the inheritance that had been stolen to gild her stepsister's cages. She thought of the Duke's hand, steady and warm, as he had led her onto the dance floor. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I accept." The Duke's carriage arrived at precisely 2:00, an imposing creation of lacquered black and silver, bearing the Avery crest on its doors. Jane stood in the entrance hall of the Everleigh household, clutching a single worn carpet bag containing everything she owned: 3 chemises, 2 petticoats, a spare dress, and her mother's pearl earrings, the only inheritance Lady Viola had failed to confiscate. "Is that all you're bringing?" The Duke's voice held a note of something that might have been concern as he descended from the carriage, his gaze taking in her meager possession. "It is all I have, Your Grace." A muscle tightened in his jaw. He turned to Lady Viola, who hovered in the doorway with Constance and Beatrice, their expressions a mixture of envy and lingering disbelief. "I trust Miss Everleigh's belongings will be sent to Avery House by week's end." "Belongings?" Lady Viola's laugh was shrill. "Your Grace, what you see is what exists. Jane has always been adequately provided for. We are not a wealthy household." "No," the Duke said softly. "You are not. Not anymore." He offered Jane his hand, helping her into the carriage with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his austere reputation. "We have several appointments this afternoon. I hope you do not object to a rather full schedule." Jane settled onto velvet cushions so soft they felt like sin against her cotton dress. "I am at your disposal, Your Grace." "Arthur," he said, taking the seat across from her. "When we are private, you may call me Arthur. We are to be married, after all." The carriage lurched into motion, and Jane watched through the window as the Everleigh house receded into the distance. She had lived there for 12 years, yet felt no pang of loss, no sentimental attachment. It had never been a home, merely a prison with wallpaper. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Madame Lisette's establishment on Bond Street. She is the finest modiste in London, patronized by the Queen herself." Arthur's expression remained neutral, but Jane detected a hint of satisfaction in his tone. "You will require a complete wardrobe befitting your new position. Morning dresses, walking dresses, evening gowns, ball gowns, riding habits, traveling clothes, and naturally, a wedding dress." Jane's head spun. "Your Grace, Arthur, that will cost a fortune. Surely a few basic gowns would suffice." "You are to be the Duchess of Avery. You will dress accordingly." His tone brooked no argument, yet when he continued, his voice softened slightly. "I am not a man who tolerates half measures, Miss Everleigh. If I am to ask you to assume the most demanding position in English society outside the royal family itself, I will ensure you have every advantage at your disposal. They traveled in silence through Mayfair's pristine streets, past townhouses Jane had only glimpsed from the servants' entrance. The world looked different from inside a duke's carriage, brighter somehow, as if a veil had been lifted. Madame Lisette's shop occupied a corner building with bow windows displaying creations of such exquisite beauty that Jane had never dared to pause and admire them. Now, the Duke handed her down from the carriage and guided her through the door with a proprietary hand at her elbow. A woman of indeterminate age with steel-gray hair and measuring eyes appeared immediately, her expression transforming from professional courtesy to genuine astonishment when she recognized the Duke. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. How may I serve you today?" "Madame Lisette, may I present Miss Jane Everleigh, my betrothed. She requires a complete trousseau. I will leave the particulars to your expert judgment, but I expect nothing less than perfection. Expense is no object. She will need everything within a fortnight." Madame Lisette's sharp gaze swept over Jane, cataloging every detail of her shabby dress and worn boots with the practiced assessment of a master tactician. But instead of the disdain Jane had braced herself for, something almost tender crossed the modist's features. "Come, mademoiselle," she said, extending a graceful hand. "Let us see what we have to work with, no?" Arthur remained in the front salon while Madame Lisette ushered Jane through a curtained doorway into a private fitting room lined with mirrors and flooded with natural light. Two assistants appeared as if summoned by invisible bells, their arms laden with fabric samples in every conceivable shade. "Remove your dress, if you please." Madame Lisette's tone was brisk, but not unkind. Jane's fingers trembled as she unfastened the hooks of her gray cotton dress. She stood in her mended chemise and darned stockings, acutely aware of how threadbare everything was, how visible the evidence of her poverty had become under the modiste's scrutiny. But Madame Lisette merely pursed her lips and began measuring with swift efficiency, calling out numbers in French to her assistants. "You have an excellent figure, mademoiselle. Slender but not without curves. Good posture despite everything. This is a blessing. Many young ladies of quality slouch abominably." "I was taught to carry books on my head," Jane said quietly, "to improve my deportment." "By whom?" "My mother, before she died." Madame Lisette's hands stilled momentarily on Jane's waist. "She taught you well. Now, we must discuss colors. With your coloring, this lovely dark hair, these fine eyes, you can wear nearly anything. But we must be strategic. Jewel tones, I think. Sapphire, emerald, deep rose, and cream, always cream, not white. White will wash you out." She pulled fabric samples with decisive movements, draping them across Jane's shoulders one after another. Silks whispered against her skin like water. Velvets held warmth like captured sunlight. Jane had never been touched by such luxury. "The Duke has requested everything," Madame Lisette continued, her tone turning almost conspiratorial. "Do you understand what this means, chérie? Not 3 dresses or 5. Everything. I have dressed duchesses before. I know what is required. You will have no fewer than 40 gowns, plus all the necessary undergarments, shoes, gloves, bonnets, shawls, pelisses, and accessories. It will take my entire staff working day and night." 40 gowns. Jane could scarcely comprehend it. She had owned 3 dresses her entire adult life. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say nothing. Simply trust me." Madame Lisette's expression grew shrewd. "I have seen many girls marry above their station, mademoiselle. Most arrive here giddy with triumph, already drunk on their good fortune. You arrive looking like a woman who has just accepted a sentence rather than a proposal. Why? Jane met her gaze in the mirror. Because I do not know how to be a duchess. I have been a servant in my own home for 12 years. I know how to press gowns, not wear them. I know how to pour tea, not preside over state dinners. The Duke needs a partner, and I fear I am only bringing him an impostor. Madame Lisette made a dismissive sound. The Duke of Avery is no fool. He chose you for a reason, and I suspect it has nothing to do with your ability to discuss Italian opera or execute a perfect curtsy. Now, hold still while I pin this bodice. For the next 2 hours, Jane stood while Madame Lisette and her assistants worked with the focused intensity of artists creating a masterpiece. Patterns were selected, adjustments debated, accessories considered. Jane watched in the mirror as silks and satins were draped across her body, transforming her from a drab moth into something almost luminous. This, Madame Lisette announced, holding up a creation in deep sapphire silk with silver embroidery, will be your presentation gown. For when the Duke introduces you to society as his Duchess, it will make a statement that you are not to be underestimated. When Jane finally emerged from the fitting room, still in her gray cotton but somehow standing taller, Arthur rose from his chair. His expression remained characteristically impassive, but his eyes traveled over her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It is settled?" he asked Madame Lisette. "Oui, Your Grace. The first delivery will arrive at Avery House within 3 days. The wedding gown within the week, and the remainder of the trousseau the following week." Arthur nodded and produced a bank draft that made Madame Lisette's eyebrows rise appreciatively. Then he offered Jane his arm, and they returned to the carriage. As they settled into their seats, Jane found herself studying this man who had upended her entire existence in less than 24 hours. His profile was severe, classical, the kind of face that might have been carved on ancient coins. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the gowns, for all of this." Arthur turned to her, and for the first time, she saw something almost vulnerable in his expression. "You thanked me for 40 gowns. Most women of the ton would have demanded twice that and complained about the delay. I am not most women of the ton." "No," he agreed, his voice dropping to something almost warm. "You are not, which is precisely why I chose you." The carriage rolled through London's gilded streets, carrying Jane toward a future she could not yet fathom. But for the first time in 12 years, that future shimmered with possibility rather than despair. She was no longer the invisible orphan. She was the future Duchess of Avery, dressed in sapphire and silver. And nothing would ever be the same. The journey north took 3 days, and with each mile, London's glittering chaos faded into rolling countryside that grew progressively wilder and more remote. Arthur had arranged for Jane to stay with his widowed aunt, Lady Arthur Wellesley, during the brief engagement period, a concession to propriety that seemed almost ironic given the unconventional nature of their arrangement. But now, with the wedding performed in a quiet ceremony at St. George's Church with only Lady Catherine and Arthur's solicitor as witnesses, they traveled together as man and wife toward the ancestral seat she would now call home. Jane sat across from her husband in the carriage, acutely aware of the gold band on her finger and the new title that sat upon her shoulders like ill-fitting armor. The Duchess of Avery. The words felt foreign in her mind, belonging to someone else entirely. Arthur had been largely silent during the journey, occupied with correspondence and estate documents that he reviewed with meticulous attention. Occasionally he would glance up and find her watching him, and something would flicker in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes that suggested he was not entirely immune to her presence. "We should arrive within the hour," he said as the afternoon light began its slow descent toward evening. "I should warn you, Thornfield Abbey is not what most would consider welcoming. It was built during the conquest as a defensive fortification. Comfort was never a primary consideration. I am not afraid of old stones, Your Grace." "Arthur," he corrected gently. "We are married now, Jane. Surely we can dispense with formality when private." The use of her Christian name in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Arthur, then." He returned his attention to the window, but not before she caught something almost pleased in his expression. The carriage crested a hill, and Jane's breath caught in her throat. Thornfield Abbey rose from the moorland like a monument to power and isolation. It was indeed a fortress. Massive gray stone walls crowned with crenellated towers, narrow windows that looked more like archers' slits than sources of light, and a great arched gatehouse that suggested armies rather than afternoon callers. The structure seemed to have grown from the very bones of the earth, ancient and immovable, defying both time and the elements with stern indifference. "It's magnificent," Jane breathed. Arthur's head turned sharply. Most women use different adjectives: forbidding, oppressive. One former betrothed compared it to a particularly grim prison. Former betrothed? A merciful escape for us both. She married an earl with a charming estate in Kent, much more suitable to her temperament. His tone was neutral, but Jane detected the faintest trace of old hurt beneath the words. The carriage passed through the gatehouse into a vast courtyard where servants assembled in formal ranks. Jane counted at least 40 staff members, all dressed in the Avery livery of deep blue and silver, all watching with barely concealed curiosity as the Duke handed his unexpected bride down from the carriage. An elderly man with silver hair and impeccable posture stepped forward. "Your Grace, welcome home, and may I extend my warmest congratulations to Her Grace on the occasion of your marriage." "Thank you, Morrison." Arthur's hand remained at Jane's elbow, a subtle gesture of support. "This is Morrison, our butler. He has served the Avery family for 43 years and knows more about running this household than I ever shall. Morrison, please present the senior staff to Her Grace." Jane endured the introductions with as much grace as she could muster. Mrs. Halloway, the housekeeper, Mr. Peters, the estate steward, Mrs. Clark, the cook, and a succession of names and faces that blurred together in her nervous exhaustion. They were all polite, all professional, but she could see the questions in their eyes. Who was this nobody who had somehow captured the Duke's hand? What secrets did she possess? If only they knew she wondered the same things herself. Arthur guided her through the great oak doors into an entrance hall that could have swallowed the entire Everleigh house 3 times over. Stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps stretched beneath vaulted ceilings. Tapestries depicting various military conquests lined the walls. A massive fireplace that could roast an entire ox dominated one end, currently cold and empty despite the evening chill. "The public rooms are on this floor," Arthur explained, his voice echoing in the vast space. "The family apartments are in the east wing. I thought you might wish to rest before dinner. The journey has been long." But Jane had stopped before a portrait gallery that lined one wall. Generations of Wellesleys stared down at her with varying degrees of aristocratic hauteur. Men in armor, in court dress, in military uniforms. Women in elaborate gowns, jewels dripping from their necks and ears. All of them looked formidable, powerful, utterly secure in their consequence. And now, she was meant to join their ranks. "They're quite intimidating, aren't they?" Arthur had come to stand beside her, his gaze traveling over his ancestors with an expression she couldn't quite read. 500 years of unbroken lineage. Crusaders, courtiers, counselors to kings. The weight of all that history can be rather crushing. Jane turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw what she had glimpsed during their dance at Carlton House, the loneliness that came from being constantly observed, yet never truly known. "Do you ever feel," she asked quietly, "as if you're not quite real? As if you're simply playing a role that someone else wrote for you?" Arthur's eyes snapped to hers, something almost startled flickering in their depths. "Every day of my life." The admission hung between them, raw and unexpected. For a moment, the Duke of Avery's carefully constructed armor cracked, and Jane saw the man beneath, isolated by his position, imprisoned by expectations, performing greatness while starving for genuine human connection. "I was invisible for 12 years, Jane said. "You are too visible. Different cages, perhaps, but cages nonetheless." "Yes." The word was barely a whisper. Arthur's hand lifted as if to touch her face, then fell back to his side. "That is precisely why I chose you, Jane. You understand." Mrs. Halloway appeared in the doorway, tactfully clearing her throat. "Your Grace, I have prepared the Duchess's apartments. Shall I show her Grace to her rooms?" Arthur nodded, the mask of ducal composure sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Of course. Jane, Mrs. Halloway will help you settle. We dine at 8. If you require anything, you need only ring." Jane followed the housekeeper through a labyrinth of corridors and up a grand staircase to the east wing. Her apartments proved to be a suite of 4 rooms, a bedchamber with a massive 4-poster bed draped in blue velvet, a sitting room with mullioned windows overlooking the moors, a dressing room already being filled with her new gowns from Madame Lisette, and a private bathing room with an actual copper tub. "His Grace's apartments adjoin yours through that door," Mrs. Halloway said, indicating a carved oak door set into the far wall. "The Dukes of Avery have traditionally maintained separate chambers, though of course the door is never locked." Heat crept up Jane's neck. The wedding had been so swift, so pragmatic, that she had scarcely considered the more intimate expectations of marriage. "I've had hot water brought for a bath," Mrs. Halloway continued, either oblivious to Jane's discomfort or too professional to acknowledge it. "And I've taken the liberty of laying out a dinner gown. Will your Grace require assistance dressing?" "No, thank you. I can manage." The housekeeper's expression softened slightly. "If I may speak plainly, Your Grace, we are all rather glad His Grace has finally married. This house has been too long without a mistress, without warmth. Perhaps you might bring some light back to these old stones." After Mrs. Halloway departed, Jane moved to the window and looked out over the darkening moors. The landscape was harsh, beautiful in its austerity. Rolling hills covered in heather, rocky outcroppings, and a sky so vast it made her feel both insignificant and strangely free. Somewhere in this fortress, Arthur was alone in his own apartments, surrounded by 500 years of history and expectation. She thought of his admission in the portrait gallery, the crack in his armor that had revealed the isolated man beneath the ducal title. He had saved her from invisibility. Perhaps in some small way, she might save him from his terrible visibility. 2 lonely people in a fortress built to withstand sieges. Maybe together they could transform it into something resembling a home. Jane pressed her hand against the cold glass and made a silent vow. She would learn to be his Duchess. But more than that, she would learn to be his companion, his partner, perhaps even his friend. The marriage might have begun as a transaction, but it did not have to remain one. In the distance, a bell tolled the hour. Jane turned from the window to prepare for dinner with her husband. The future Duchess had arrived at her fortress. Now began the real work of claiming it. Jane's first week at Thornfield Abbey passed in a blur of instruction and overwhelming responsibility. Mrs. Halloway guided her through the intricacies of managing a household with 47 servants, 16 guest bedrooms, and a wine cellar that predated the Tudors. Arthur spent his days sequestered in meetings with his steward and various tenants, emerging only for dinner, where they would engage in careful, polite conversation that revealed nothing of substance. They were strangers sharing a surname, circling each other with wary courtesy. On the 8th morning, Jane woke before dawn to find a note slipped under her door. Arthur's handwriting was precise, almost austere. The estate ledgers require review. Would appreciate your mathematical eye if you are amenable. Library, A.W. She dressed quickly in one of her new morning gowns, a practical dove-gray silk that Madame Lisette had declared suitable for scholarly pursuits, and made her way through the silent corridors to the library. The room took her breath away. 3 stories of books rose toward a painted ceiling depicting various classical scenes of learning. Leather-bound volumes lined every available surface, their spines bearing titles in Latin, Greek, French, and English. Morning light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced like tiny stars. Arthur stood at a massive desk near the windows, already dressed despite the early hour, his dark hair slightly disheveled as if he had run his hands through it in frustration. He looked up when she entered, and something eased in his expression. "You came. I wasn't certain you would. You requested my mathematical eye. I'm curious what prompted such faith in my abilities." A hint of amusement crossed his features. "Lady Catherine mentioned that you helped her reconcile her household accounts during your stay. She said you found a discrepancy her own steward had missed for 3 years. I thought perhaps you might apply that talent to a rather vexing problem." He gestured to the desk, which was covered in ledgers dating back decades. "My father was many things, but a meticulous record keeper was not among them. I've been attempting to reconstruct various business transactions from the early 80s. There are gaps, inconsistencies. Morrison mentioned you had expressed interest in the estate's history." Jane moved to the desk, her fingers trailing over the ancient leather bindings. "What kind of transactions?" "Investments, primarily. My father partnered with several gentlemen on various ventures, shipping, mining, trade consortiums. Some were profitable, others—" He pulled a ledger toward him, frowning at a column of figures. "Others seem to have simply vanished, along with the capital invested." For the next hour, they worked in companionable silence. Jane discovered she enjoyed the puzzle of it, tracking payments across multiple ledgers, identifying patterns in the chaos of her father-in-law's haphazard bookkeeping. Arthur proved to be an attentive collaborator, his questions sharp and his memory for details impressive. "Here," Jane said, pointing to an entry dated March 1805. "This payment of £15,000, there's no corresponding receipt or partnership document, just a notation. Investment per agreement." Arthur leaned closer, his shoulder brushing hers as he examined the entry. Jane caught the scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him. The E could refer to any number of ventures. My father was not given to clarity in his records. Jane turned the page, then froze. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat in her chest. There, in the neat handwriting of a clerk, was a detailed partnership agreement dated April 1805. And at the bottom, 2 signatures, the late Duke of Avery's bold scrawl, and beneath it, in the careful, measured hand she had known since childhood, Edward Everleigh. Her father's name, her father's signature. The room tilted slightly. Jane gripped the edge of the desk, staring at the impossible evidence before her. Arthur had gone very still beside her. "Your father?" "Yes." The word came out barely above a whisper. "That's his signature. I would know it anywhere." Arthur pulled the ledger closer, his expression shifting from surprise to something more calculating. A West Indies trading venture. Sugar, primarily, with provisions for cotton and rum. The partnership was to run for 5 years with profits divided equally. Your father contributed £15,000. My father contributed ships and trading connections. Jane's mind raced. £15,000. The exact sum Arthur had claimed her stepmother owed the Avery estate. But that made no sense. If her father had been a partner, not a debtor, then... The venture failed, Arthur continued, his voice taking on a grim quality. Spectacularly. Pirates seized 2 ships. A third went down in a hurricane. My father lost a considerable sum. I had assumed the debt notations referred to a loan he had extended to help the Everleigh family recover from the losses. But if they were partners... Jane's legal mind, honed by years of reading her father's law books in secret, began assembling the pieces. Then my father's investment was capital, not debt. Which means there should be no outstanding obligation. Arthur's jaw tightened. The losses were shared according to the partnership terms. When the venture collapsed, both families absorbed their respective damages. No debt, no repayment owed. Jane turned to face him fully. Then why did you tell my stepmother she owed £22,000? For a long moment, Arthur said nothing. He moved to the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning light. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Because I needed leverage to secure your hand in marriage. And Lady Viola needed a compelling reason to part with you. The admission hung between them like a blade. Jane felt something twist in her chest, not quite anger, not quite hurt, but a complicated tangle of both. So the debt was a fiction, a manipulation. Yes. You fabricated a legal obligation to coerce my stepmother into giving me to you. Yes. Arthur turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Though I would argue that coercion is too strong a word. I offered her a solution to her very real financial problems in exchange for something she clearly did not value. You. That is not the point. Jane's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. You lied. You built our entire arrangement on a foundation of deception. I did. Arthur's gray eyes met hers without flinching. And I would do it again. Because the alternative was leaving you to be sent to Yorkshire as a governess, invisible and forgotten for the rest of your life. Was that preferable to becoming my duchess under slightly false pretenses? Jane wanted to rage at him, to throw the ledger at his aristocratic head. But beneath her anger, a more uncomfortable truth emerged. He was right. Lady Viola had been planning to dispose of her. The governess position was real, the exile certain. Arthur had simply used the tools at his disposal, his power, his wealth, his willingness to bend the truth, to extract her from that fate. You should have told me, she said finally. Would you have accepted if you had known? Jane considered the question honestly. Would she have agreed to marry him if she had known the debt was fabricated? If she had understood that his proposal was not a noble rescue, but a calculated acquisition? I don't know, she admitted. Arthur crossed the room to stand before her. I am not a good man, Jane. I am not kind or gentle or given to romantic gestures. I saw something I wanted, someone I wanted, and I used every advantage at my disposal to secure it. That is what men like me do. We see, we strategize, we acquire. I am not a ship or a trading venture to be acquired. No, he agreed softly. You are infinitely more valuable than either. Which is precisely why I was willing to fabricate a debt, manipulate your stepmother, and upend both our lives to make you my wife. Jane searched his face for any trace of remorse or apology and found neither. What she found instead was something more complicated, a fierce protectiveness mixed with an almost vulnerable honesty. He was not sorry for what he had done. He was only sorry she had discovered it. The partnership agreement, Jane said, forcing her mind back to the ledger. If my father invested £15,000 and the venture failed completely, then my family lost everything in that investment. Most likely. The timing aligns with what you told me, that your father's fortune disappeared before his death. Jane turned back to the desk, her fingers tracing the faded ink of her father's signature. He had been here, in this very library perhaps, signing this agreement with the old Duke. He had trusted in this partnership, invested everything, and lost it all. There is more, Arthur said quietly. He pulled another ledger from the stack, opening it to a page marked with a ribbon. This is dated 2 months before your father's death. A personal loan from my father to yours. £5,000, interest-free, repayable upon request. Jane stared at the entry. £5,000. A fortune. And beneath it, a notation in the old Duke's hand. For Edward, in friendship and remembrance of shared sorrows. They were friends, she whispered. It would appear so. Which means... Arthur's expression shifted, something almost tender crossing his features. Which means, when I saw you at Carlton House, when I felt that inexplicable pull toward you, perhaps it was not so inexplicable after all. Perhaps some part of me recognized what my conscious mind did not. That our families were already bound together by history and loss. Jane looked up at her husband, this complicated man who had lied to secure her and was now offering her a truth that somehow made the lie more forgivable. What happened to the loan? Was it ever repaid? No record of repayment. Which means technically your stepmother does owe the Avery estate. Not £22,000, but £5,000 plus accumulated interest. A laugh escaped Jane despite everything, sharp, slightly bitter. So your fabricated debt was actually real. Just in a different amount and for a different reason. Life, Arthur said with the faintest hint of a smile, is rarely as simple as we wish it to be. Jane sat down in the leather chair behind the desk, suddenly exhausted. In the span of an hour, she had discovered that her father and Arthur's were friends, that their families' fortunes were entangled long before she and Arthur ever met, and that her marriage, which she had thought built on lies, was perhaps destined by forces neither of them had understood. "What do we do with this information?" she asked. Arthur moved to stand beside her chair, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder with unexpected gentleness. "We move forward. We acknowledge that our beginning was unconventional, perhaps even manipulative, but we use what we have learned to build something honest. Your father and mine were friends who trusted each other. Perhaps we might honor their memory by attempting the same." Jane placed her hand over his, feeling the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of her gown. "Trust must be earned, Your Grace." "Arthur," he corrected. "And you are right. Which is why I am telling you now. There are no more secrets between us. No more fabrications. Whatever we build from this moment forward will be founded on truth." Jane looked up at him, searching his gray eyes for sincerity, and found it. He was offering her something precious, a fresh beginning, a partnership built not on lies, but on the complicated, messy truth of who they actually were. "Very well," she said. "Truth, then. Starting now." "Starting now," Arthur agreed. And in the library filled with 500 years of history, surrounded by the evidence of their father's friendship, the Duke and Duchess of Avery began again. The revelation about their father's friendship shifted something fundamental between them. Jane found herself seeking Arthur's company not out of obligation, but genuine interest, and he, in turn, began to unbend in her presence. Small degrees at first, like ice beginning its slow thaw towards spring. It was Arthur who suggested the arrangement 3 days after their discovery in the library. They were breakfasting together, a new habit Jane had initiated by simply appearing in the small dining room each morning until Arthur accepted her presence as routine. "You need to learn how to command this household," he said, setting down his coffee with characteristic precision. "Mrs. Halloway is capable, but she requires direction. The staff looks to the Duchess for leadership in domestic matters. Currently, they see uncertainty." Jane's first instinct was to bridle at the criticism, but she recognized truth when she heard it. "I have spent 12 years receiving orders, not giving them. The transition is more difficult than I anticipated. Then we shall practice." Arthur's expression remained serious, but something almost playful flickered in his eyes. "I will teach you how to wield authority. And in exchange—" "Yes?" He hesitated, his fingers drumming once against the table, a rare gesture of uncertainty from a man who seemed carved from confidence. "You might teach me how to be less formidable. Lady Catherine mentioned that I have a tendency to terrify people without intending to." Jane bit back a smile. "You do project a certain glacial quality." "The Ice Duke," Arthur said dryly. "Yes, I am aware of the sobriquet. It has served me well in political negotiations, but is perhaps less ideal in personal relations." "Very well. An exchange of lessons, then. Authority for approachability." They began that very afternoon. Arthur summoned the senior staff to the morning room where Jane sat in a high-backed chair positioned to catch the light. A deliberate staging, she realized, to create an atmosphere of natural authority. "Mrs. Halloway," Arthur said, his tone carrying the weight of ducal command. "Her Grace has some questions regarding the household operations. You will provide complete transparency in all matters." The housekeeper curtsied. "Of course, Your Grace." Arthur turned to Jane, one eyebrow raised in expectation. She understood the challenge. He had created the opening, but she must walk through it. Jane straightened her spine, channeling every ounce of dignity she possessed. "Mrs. Halloway, I have reviewed the household accounts. I notice the expenditure for candles has increased by 30% over the past quarter. Please explain." Mrs. Halloway's eyes widened slightly, surprised that the new Duchess had actually examined the ledgers. "Well, Your Grace, we have been preparing more rooms for potential guests, and His Grace often works late in the library, requiring additional lighting." "I see. And has the Duke been working later than usual, or is this a long-standing pattern?" "More recent, Your Grace. Since your arrival, actually." Jane glanced at Arthur, who maintained his impassive expression, though she detected the faintest hint of color on his cheekbones. He had been avoiding his chambers, staying in the library until exhaustion forced him to seek his bed, maintaining the careful distance between them. "Then, we shall install additional oil lamps in the library," Jane decided. "More cost-effective than candles and better for His Grace's eyes. Please coordinate with Mr. Peters regarding the purchase." "Very good, Your Grace." Mrs. Halloway's tone had shifted subtly, less indulgent, more genuinely respectful. After the housekeeper departed, Arthur leaned back in his chair, studying Jane with unconcealed approval. "Well done. You identified the issue, proposed a practical solution, and gave clear direction. That is precisely how authority functions." I felt like a fraud. All authority begins as performance. Eventually, the performance becomes reality. He stood, offering his hand. "Now, shall we walk the grounds? I believe it is my turn to receive instruction." They strolled through Thornfield's formal gardens, past geometrically precise hedges and roses that were just beginning to show their autumn foliage. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gravel paths. "Your problem," Jane said after they had walked in silence for several minutes, "is that you never allow anyone to see you uncertain. You present as if you have already calculated every possible outcome and selected the optimal path. It is impressive, but deeply alienating. Uncertainty is weakness. My father taught me that from childhood." "Your father was wrong." Jane stopped walking, turning to face him. "Uncertainty is human. People do not trust perfection, Arthur. They trust vulnerability." He looked skeptical. "You suggest I should broadcast my doubts and insecurities to the household staff?" "I suggest you might occasionally smile when something pleases you, or express frustration when something goes wrong, or admit when you do not have an immediate answer." She paused, then added more softly, "You might allow yourself to be a person, not merely a position." Arthur's jaw tightened. For a moment, Jane thought she had pushed too far. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, rusty sound as if the mechanism had not been used in years. "My last betrothed told me I had the emotional range of a marble statue." She was not incorrect. What happened to her? She met a cavalry officer at a house party. They eloped within a fortnight. I received a very apologetic letter explaining that she could not marry a man who made her feel as if she were being assessed for purchase like a broodmare. Jane winced. That must have been painful. It was a relief. Arthur resumed walking, his hands clasped behind his back. I did not love her, and she certainly did not love me. We were performing the roles expected of us, the Duke securing an appropriate Duchess, the Earl's daughter securing an advantageous match. When she fled, I was freed from a lifetime of mutual dissatisfaction. Yet you sought another wife eventually. Me. You were different. Arthur glanced at her, something almost vulnerable in his expression. You did not look at me and see a title or a fortune or a strategic alliance. You looked at me and saw a man catching a woman who had been deliberately humiliated. You saw me as someone capable of kindness rather than merely capable of power. Jane felt warmth bloom in her chest. You were kind. You did not have to intervene. I could not do otherwise. The cruelty was intolerable. He paused, then added with careful precision, and you, standing there in your mended dress with such dignity despite their mockery, you were the most genuinely courageous person I had ever encountered. They had reached a secluded corner of the garden where a stone bench sat beneath an ancient oak. Jane settled onto it, and after a moment's hesitation, Arthur sat beside her. Tell me something true, Jane said. Something you have never told anyone. Arthur was quiet for so long she thought he might refuse. Then finally, I am terrified of becoming my father. He was brilliant, accomplished, respected, and utterly alone. He died surrounded by servants and solicitors, but no one who genuinely mourned him as a person rather than a position. I looked at his funeral and realized I was following his exact path same isolation, same performance, same inevitable loneliness. And then you met me. And then I met you. Arthur's hand found hers on the bench, his fingers threading through hers with surprising gentleness. I thought perhaps if I married someone who had known true loneliness, someone who understood isolation from the opposite perspective, we might find a way to be less alone together. Jane squeezed his hand. That is the saddest and most honest marriage proposal I have ever heard. It was not a proposal. The proposal involved fabricated debts and strategic manipulation. True. Jane turned to face him fully, searching his austere features. But this honesty is worth far more than any romantic declaration. Arthur's thumb traced small circles on her palm, a gesture that seemed unconscious, as if his body sought connection even when his mind maintained careful distance. You have not yet fulfilled your part of our bargain. I have not smiled once during this conversation. You laughed earlier. That counts? That was a derisive bark, not a genuine expression of pleasure. Jane considered him thoughtfully. Then, with deliberate mischief, she said, Mrs. Halloway told me that you have been leaving books in my sitting room. Poetry, specifically. Byron, Wordsworth, even some scandalous French novels that I suspect you had to retrieve from locked cabinets. Arthur's expression went carefully blank, the same look he employed during political negotiations. I have no idea what you are referencing. And yesterday, I found a lap desk in my chambers that I did not request. Mahogany, with mother-of-pearl inlay, equipped with the finest stationery. The footman claimed it was ordered weeks ago, but I suspect that is a fiction you instructed him to maintain. Pure coincidence? And this morning, there were hothouse flowers on my breakfast tray, roses specifically. Not from the garden, which means someone, and by someone, I mean you, sent to London for them. The corner of Arthur's mouth twitched. I may have mentioned to the head gardener that you admired roses. In November, when they do not bloom naturally. An oversight on nature's part. The twitch became more pronounced. Jane leaned closer, delighted by this crack in his formidable composure. You are courting me, Arthur, after we are already married. That is possibly the most endearing thing I have ever witnessed. I am doing no such thing. I am merely ensuring the Duchess of Avery has appropriate accommodations and diversions. You are courting me with books and flowers and beautiful writing desks because you do not know how to simply say that you enjoy my company. Arthur's control finally broke. A smile spread across his face, genuine, warm, transforming his severe features into something almost boyish. You are absurdly pleased with yourself for deducing this. I am. Jane laughed, the sound bright and unrestrained. And you are smiling, a real smile. We have both succeeded in our lessons. Arthur shook his head, but the smile remained. You are going to be utterly impossible to live with, aren't you? Undoubtedly. But you chose me specifically because I am not a marble statue either. I did. Arthur's hand tightened on hers. And I find I am profoundly grateful for that choice. Fabricated debts and all. They sat together beneath the oak tree as the autumn afternoon faded toward evening. The Ice Duke and the Invisible Orphan learning the complicated choreography of being simply Arthur and Jane. Two people who had found each other through manipulation and necessity, and were choosing, moment by moment, to build something honest from those flawed foundations. And in the gardens of Thornfield Abbey, surrounded by precisely trimmed hedges and deliberately ordered beauty, something wild and unexpected began to bloom. The letter arrived on a gray November morning, delivered with the regular post, but carrying the unmistakable scent of malicious intent. Jane recognized her stepmother's handwriting immediately. The elaborate flourishes that suggested refinement while barely concealing vulgarity. "Lady Viola writes that she and my stepsisters wish to pay us a visit," Jane said, setting the letter beside her teacup with more force than necessary. Along with their husbands, the Earl of Asherton and the Earl of Pembroke, she suggests a week's stay would be most agreeable, as they are traveling north and Thornfield lies conveniently on their route. Arthur looked up from his correspondence, his expression unreadable. "Conveniently? How thoughtful of them to remember our existence now that you are a duchess. You need not agree to this. I have no desire to see them. Which is precisely why we shall invite them." Arthur's voice took on a steely quality that Jane had learned to recognize as his strategic mind engaging. "They come to assess whether the poor orphan has embarrassed herself in her new position, to mock your lack of pedigree and remind you of your place. We shall disabuse them of several notions simultaneously." "Arthur, trust me." His gray eyes met hers with something that might have been protective fury barely leashed. "You have spent 12 years enduring their cruelty. Allow me 1 week to return it with interest." 3 days later, the Everleigh party arrived in a cavalcade of carriages that seemed designed to impress. Luggage strapped to every available surface, liveried servants trailing behind. Constance and Beatrice dressed in traveling costumes that probably cost more than the average tenant farmer earned in a year. Jane stood beside Arthur on the front steps of Thornfield Abbey, very deliberately positioned on the higher ground. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that Madame Lisette had designed specifically for receiving guests. Elegant without ostentation. The kind of dress that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. The Avery diamonds rested cool and heavy against her collarbone, a 3-strand necklace that had belonged to Arthur's grandmother and was worth more than both Earls' estates combined. "My dear Jane." Lady Viola descended from the lead carriage with affected grace, her arms extended as if greeting a beloved daughter rather than the girl she had treated as an unpaid servant. "How wonderful to see you looking so well situated." "Lady Viola," Jane's voice was cordial, distant. "Welcome to Thornfield Abbey." Constance and Beatrice emerged next, flanked by their husbands. The Earl of Asherton was a portly man of 40, with thinning hair and the florid complexion of someone too fond of port. The Earl of Pembroke appeared younger, but carried himself with the pompous self-importance of a man who had inherited his title at 21 and believed it made him extraordinary. "Your Grace," Constance said, executing a curtsy that somehow managed to convey condescension. "What an imposing residence. Quite Gothic." "I confess I prefer the more modern sensibilities of Asherton Hall. So much lighter and more cheerful." "Yes," Arthur said, his tone perfectly pleasant and utterly devastating. "I have heard that newer estates often compensate for their lack of historical significance with an abundance of windows. Thornfield was built to withstand sieges. It has been in my family for 500 years. We value substance over fashion." The Earl of Asherton's face reddened. Constance's smile became fixed. Arthur continued without pause, turning to the Earl of Pembroke. "And, Lord Pembroke, welcome. I trust your journey was not too taxing. I understand your estate lies in Derbyshire. The Pembroke line is relatively recent, if I recall. Your grandfather purchased the title during the financial reforms of 1780. It was delivered with perfect courtesy. But the insult was unmistakable. Purchased title versus inherited legacy. New money versus old power. My grandfather was a self-made man, Pembroke said stiffly. He earned his position through merit. How admirable. Commerce can indeed elevate a family, Given sufficient time and advantageous marriages. Arthur's hand settled at the small of Jane's back, a possessive and protective gesture. Shall we go inside? I am certain you are all eager to refresh yourselves after your journey. The week that followed was a masterclass in aristocratic warfare, with Arthur wielding his ducal authority like a perfectly honed blade. At dinner the first evening, Lady Viola made the mistake of commenting on the quaintness of serving only 4 courses rather than the elaborate 8-course meals fashionable in London. We find excessive dining tedious, Arthur replied. The Queen herself commented during our last visit to court that the Avery household sets a standard of elegant restraint. But I suppose those newly elevated to the peerage might feel the need to demonstrate their wealth through ostentation. It is quite understandable, really. Beatrice choked on her wine. The Earl of Asherton stared at his plate. The following afternoon, Constance suggested a tour of the portrait gallery, clearly intending to emphasize Jane's lack of aristocratic lineage. How fascinating it must be, she said, gazing up at the rows of Wellesley ancestors, to have such a distinguished family history. Of course, Jane, you cannot claim such heritage. Your dear mother was merely a vicar's daughter, was she not? She was, Jane said evenly. Arthur stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Jane's maternal grandfather was the Reverend Thomas Hartley, a noted scholar whose theological texts are still studied at Oxford. Her father, as you know, was a gentleman of significant means whose family held land in Sussex for 2 centuries. The Everleigh line, while not titled, descends from respected gentry. He paused, allowing his words to settle before delivering the coup de grace. My own great-grandmother was the daughter of a bishop. I have always believed that true distinction comes from character and intellect, rather than accidents of birth. But I suppose those who possess only the latter must cling to it desperately, having little else to recommend them. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Constance's face went white, then red. Beatrice developed a sudden interest in her handkerchief. But it was during the formal dinner on the 4th evening that Arthur truly eviscerated them. The Earl of Pembroke, emboldened by wine and masculine company, made a comment about Jane's remarkable elevation, and wondered aloud whether she found the responsibilities of her position overwhelming, given her limited experience with society. Arthur set down his wine glass with deliberate precision. The entire table fell silent. Limited experience, he repeated softly. How interesting that you should mention that, Pembroke. Tell me, how many households have you successfully managed? How many tenant disputes have you arbitrated? How many estate ledgers have you personally audited for accuracy? Pembroke blinked. Well, I have stewards for such matters. Indeed, as do I. Yet my wife has, in the space of 3 weeks, identified and corrected accounting errors dating back 5 years, implemented a new system for managing household expenditures that has already reduced waste by 20%, and personally mediated a dispute between 2 tenant families that my own steward had failed to resolve in 6 months. Arthur's gaze swept the table, settling on each guest in turn. Jane's limited experience consists of managing a household with minimal resources while maintaining dignity under circumstances that would have broken lesser souls. She has demonstrated more genuine capability in 3 weeks as my Duchess than most women of the ton demonstrate in a lifetime of ornamental existence. He stood, his height and presence dominating the room. If any of you interpret her kindness as weakness, or her humble origins as deficiency, allow me to clarify. Jane is my choice, my wife, my Duchess, and I will tolerate no disrespect toward her under my roof. Am I perfectly clear? The silence was absolute. Lady Viola had gone pale. Constance and Beatrice stared at their plates. Both Earls suddenly found the ceiling architecture fascinating. "Excellent," Arthur said, his tone returning to casual pleasantness. "Now, shall we retire to the drawing room? I believe Jane has arranged for musical entertainment." Later that night, after the guests had retreated to their chambers, Jane found Arthur in the library. He stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit moors, his posture rigid with residual tension. "You did not have to do that," she said softly. "I did, actually." Arthur turned to face her, and she saw raw emotion in his eyes. Anger, yes, but also something fiercer, more protective. "I watched you endure their condescension for 4 days. Every veiled insult, every patronizing comment, every reminder of your supposed inferiority. And I watched you respond with grace and dignity while they proved themselves to be exactly what I have always known the provincial nobility to be: small-minded, insecure, and utterly without substance." Jane crossed the room to stand before him. "You were magnificent." I was furious. His hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle despite the intensity in his expression. "They treated you as if you were still the invisible orphan they could dismiss and demean. They have no concept of what you truly are." "And what am I?" "Extraordinary." The word was fierce, certain. "Brilliant, resilient, kind, despite every reason to have become bitter. You are worth 100 of them, Jane, 1,000. And I will spend every day ensuring they, and everyone else, understands that truth." Jane's throat tightened with emotion. She placed her hands over his, feeling the tremor of controlled fury still running through him. "No one has ever defended me before." "Then they were fools." Arthur's thumb traced her cheekbone with devastating tenderness. "You are my wife, my partner, and I protect what is mine." "Yours?" Jane repeated softly, testing the word. "If you will have me." Something vulnerable crossed his face. "I know this began as a transaction, a strategic arrangement, but it has become something more for me, Jane. Somewhere between the library ledgers and the garden conversations and watching you transform this fortress into something resembling a home, I find I am no longer performing the role of husband. I am simply being one." Jane's heart expanded in her chest, too large suddenly for the space it occupied. "And I am no longer performing the role of wife." "No?" Arthur's voice dropped to a whisper. "No, I am becoming one. To you. Only you." He kissed her then, soft and careful, as if she were something precious that might shatter. When he pulled back, he was smiling. That genuine smile she had worked so hard to earn. "Your stepfamily is leaving tomorrow," he said. "I may have mentioned to Lady Viola that we have prior commitments that prevent us from entertaining them further." Jane laughed. "We have no such commitments." "We do now. I am committed to spending time with my wife without the burden of insufferable house guests. That seems quite pressing, don't you think?" "Extraordinarily pressing, Your Grace." "Arthur," he corrected, pulling her closer. "Arthur," she agreed. And in the library at Thornfield Abbey, the Duke and his Duchess stood together, no longer bound by fabricated debts or strategic necessity, but by something far more powerful. The choice to build a partnership from honesty, protection, and the slow, certain knowledge that they had found in each other exactly what they needed. Not a perfect love story, perhaps, but a true one. The storm arrived without warning, as northern storms often did. Jane woke to the sound of rain lashing against the windows like gravel thrown by an angry hand, wind howling through the ancient stones of Thornfield Abbey with a voice that seemed almost human. Thunder rolled across the moors, each crack loud enough to rattle the glass in its leaded frames. She sat up in the darkness, her heart racing from the violence of the sound. The fire in her chamber had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see by. Another crack of thunder split the night, and Jane flinched despite herself. A soft knock sounded at the adjoining door. "Jane?" Arthur's voice came through the oak, tight with concern. "Are you well?" She pulled her wrapper around her shoulders and crossed to unlock the door. Arthur stood in the threshold dressed in shirt sleeves and trousers, his dark hair disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it. In the dim light, he looked younger, less formidable, almost vulnerable. "I'm fine," she said. "Only startled. The storm is quite fierce. The worst I've seen in years." Arthur's gaze searched her face. "I thought I heard. That is, I wanted to ensure you were not frightened." Jane felt warmth bloom in her chest at his concern. In the month since her stepfamily's departure, something had shifted between them. The careful distance they had maintained had given way to an easy companionship. Shared meals, long conversations, moments of comfortable silence. But Arthur still retreated to his own chambers each night, maintaining the last boundary between them. Until now. "I confess storms have never troubled me," Jane said. "I find them rather magnificent, actually. All that unleashed power." Lightning flashed, illuminating Arthur's face for a heartbeat. "Would you think me foolish if I admitted they unsettle me? You? The unshakable Duke of Avery? Even dukes can have irrational fears." A wry smile crossed his features. "My mother died during a storm. I was 7 years old. The physician could not reach us in time because the roads had flooded. I sat in the nursery listening to thunder while she—" His voice caught. "I have associated storms with loss ever since." Jane's throat tightened. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. "I'm sorry. I did not know." "How could you? I have never told anyone." Arthur's fingers laced through hers, holding on as if she were an anchor in turbulent water. "But I find I am telling you all manner of things I have never spoken aloud. You have a way of drawing truth from me, Jane Everleigh." "Jane Wellesley," she corrected softly. "I am a duchess now, remember?" How could I forget? But there was something in his voice, a tension that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. Another crash of thunder shook the windows. Arthur's hand tightened on hers. "Stay," Jane said impulsively. Simply stay. We could sit by the fire, talk until the storm passes. I have no desire to sleep, and you clearly have no desire to be alone." Arthur's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to catalog. "That would be highly improper. We are married." "Yes. But we have been maintaining separate chambers, for propriety, to allow you time to adjust to—" He stopped, seeming to realize he was explaining something neither of them truly believed anymore. "To adjust to what? Being your wife?" Jane tugged him gently into her chamber, closing the door behind them. "I have been your wife for over a month, Arthur. I have managed your household, hosted your neighbors, sat beside you at dinner every evening. The only adjustment remaining is the one we both keep avoiding." She guided him to the settee near the dying fire and added wood with practiced efficiency until flames began to catch and grow. Arthur watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "You were not supposed to be so brave," he said quietly. Jane settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "What do you mean?" "When I proposed this arrangement, When I fabricated that debt and manipulated your stepmother, I told myself I was rescuing you. That you would be grateful, compliant, perhaps eventually companionable. A wife who would manage my household and grace my table without demanding anything inconvenient like emotional intimacy. Lightning flashed again, throwing stark shadows across his face. In the silence that followed, Jane could hear only the rain and the thunder of her own heartbeat. But you were not compliant, Arthur continued, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. You questioned me, challenged me, saw through every defense I had spent 30 years perfecting. You made me laugh in the garden. You caught me leaving books in your sitting room and called it courting. You looked at me during that dinner with your stepfamily as if I had done something heroic rather than simply being decent. You were heroic. No. Arthur turned to face her fully, and Jane saw raw honesty in his gray eyes. I was selfish. I have been selfish from the beginning, Jane, and I need to tell you the truth before I lose my courage. What truth? Arthur drew a shaky breath. I told you I chose you because you possessed character and intelligence. Because I needed a practical partner rather than an ornamental wife. And those things were true, but they were not the whole truth. He stood abruptly, moving to the window where rain streamed down the glass like tears. The whole truth is that I saw you at that ball, standing in the shadows in your mended dress while your stepsisters preened at the center of attention. And I felt something shift inside my chest. Something I had never felt before. You were so utterly, devastatingly real. Jane's breath caught. Everyone else in that ballroom was performing, Arthur said, his voice barely audible above the storm. Playing roles, maintaining facades, calculating advantages. But you stood there with such quiet dignity, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, simply enduring. And when your stepmother humiliated you, when she deliberately tripped you to make you look clumsy, the look on your face was not anger or self-pity, it was resignation, as if cruelty was simply the price of existing. He turned back to her, and Jane saw the shimmer of unshed tears in his eyes. I caught you because I could not do otherwise. Because in that moment, you were the only genuine thing in a room full of beautiful lies. And I knew with absolute certainty, that if I let you disappear back into invisibility, I would regret it for the rest of my life. Thunder rolled overhead, but Jane barely heard it. She stood slowly, crossing to where Arthur stood rigid by the window. So you fabricated a debt, she said softly. So I fabricated a debt. I manipulated circumstances, coerced your stepmother, and constructed an elaborate justification for doing what I desperately wanted to do anyway. Take you away from that place and make you mine. His jaw tightened. Not for duty, not for practicality, because I looked at you and saw something I had been searching for my entire life without knowing it. What did you see? Home. The word was barely a whisper. I saw home, Jane. Not a place, but a person. Someone I could be real with. Someone who would not expect me to be the ice duke or the perfect peer or the strategic heir. Someone who would simply let me be Arthur. Jane's vision blurred with tears. She reached up to cup his face, feeling the tension in his jaw, the rapid pulse at his temple. And what did I get in return? Arthur's hands came up to cover hers, pressing them against his face as if memorizing the sensation. A man who has no idea how to love properly, but is desperately trying to learn. A fortress that needs your warmth to become a home. And a heart that has been locked away for so long, I was not certain it still functioned. Until you. Until me, Jane repeated. Until you. Arthur's voice broke. I am not asking you to love me, Jane. I know this began wrong, built on lies and manipulation. But I am asking if you might allow me to love you, to court you properly, even though we are already married, to earn what I took by deception. Jane felt tears spill down her cheeks. You impossible man. Do you truly not know? Know what? That I already love you. The words came out fierce, certain. Not the Duke of Avery, not the strategic arrangement or the fabricated debt. You, Arthur, the man who leaves books in my sitting room because he does not know how to say he enjoys my company. Who defended me against my stepfamily with such controlled fury I thought he might challenge both Earls to a duel. Who is afraid of storms because they remind him of losing his mother, but came to check on me anyway. Arthur made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. That is remarkably foolish of you. Yes, well, we are both apparently prone to foolish decisions. You married a penniless orphan. I fell in love with a man who thinks emotions are strategic weaknesses. I do not think that anymore. Arthur pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair. You have comprehensively destroyed that particular delusion. They stood together while the storm raged outside. Two people who had found each other through deception and chosen each other through truth. Jane could feel Arthur trembling, with relief or fear, or perhaps simply the release of emotions too long contained. Stay with me, she whispered against his chest. Not in separate chambers, maintaining proper distance. Stay with me. Be my husband in truth, not just in name. Arthur pulled back enough to search her face, his expression vulnerable in a way she had never seen. Are you certain? I have never been more certain of anything. Jane rose on her toes to press her lips to his, soft and sure. I choose you, Arthur. Not the Duke. Not the fortress, or the title, or the strategic alliance. You. Only you. He kissed her then with a desperation that spoke of months of restraint finally breaking, of walls carefully constructed over years crumbling under the force of genuine feeling. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Arthur rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said. The words awkward and unpracticed, but utterly sincere. I do not know how to do this properly. I will undoubtedly make mistakes. But I love you, Jane. Completely. Irrevocably. That, Jane said, smiling through her tears, is all I have ever wanted to hear. Outside, the storm began to ease. The thunder grew more distant, the rain softening to a steady patter against the windows. But inside Jane's chamber, a different kind of storm had finally broken. The kind that cleared the air and left everything cleaner, brighter, more real than before. Arthur lifted her in his arms with surprising gentleness, carrying her toward the great canopied bed. No more separate chambers, he said. No more separate chambers, Jane agreed. And as the storm faded into memory, the Duke and Duchess of Avery finally became what they had been circling toward since that first dance at Carlton House. Not a strategic arrangement or a rescue mission, but two people choosing love in the wreckage of loneliness. Real, raw, irrevocably theirs. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late December, delivered not by regular post, but by a London solicitor who insisted on speaking with the Duke immediately. Jane was in the morning room, reviewing household menus, when Morrison appeared with a troubled expression. Your Grace, there is a Mr. Cornelius Blackwell requesting an audience with His Grace on a matter of utmost urgency. He claims it concerns the validity of your marriage. The words hit Jane like a physical blow. She set down her pen with careful precision, her mind already racing through possibilities. Where is the Duke? In his study, Your Grace. He has asked that you join him. Jane found Arthur standing behind his desk, his expression carved from granite as he read a document that trembled slightly in his hands, the only visible sign of his fury. Mr. Blackwell, a thin man with nervous eyes and the perpetually anxious demeanor of someone delivering bad news, stood at a respectful distance. Jane, Arthur's voice was dangerously soft. Mr. Blackwell has brought a petition from your stepmother. What kind of petition? An annulment suit. Arthur's jaw tightened. Lady Viola claims that our marriage was contracted under false pretenses and should be declared void. She has submitted this petition to the ecclesiastical court with supporting documentation. Jane felt the room tilt slightly. What documentation? Mr. Blackwell cleared his throat nervously. Lady Viola has produced a certificate of indenture dated 6 months prior to your marriage to His Grace. The document indicates that you, Miss Jane Everleigh, were legally bound as an indentured servant to Lady Viola for a period of 7 years in exchange for room, board, and care following your father's death. According to the law, an indentured servant cannot enter into a legal contract of marriage without the express consent of their master. The words landed like blows. Jane gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. That is absurd. I was never indentured. My father left me in Lady Viola's guardianship, not her servitude. Nevertheless, Mr. Blackwell continued miserably, the document bears what appears to be your signature, witnessed by 2 parties and properly sealed. Lady Viola's solicitor argues that your marriage to the Duke was therefore illegal from its inception, as you did not possess the legal capacity to consent. Arthur moved around the desk with predatory grace. Show me this document. Mr. Blackwell produced a yellowed paper from his leather case with trembling hands. Jane watched as Arthur examined it with the meticulous attention he brought to all matters of business. She could see the moment he recognized something, a slight narrowing of his eyes. This is dated March 1808, Arthur said quietly, which would have made Jane 17 years old at the time of signing. Yes, Your Grace. And these witnesses, Mrs. Pemberton and Mr. Davies, are they available to testify to the authenticity of this document? Mrs. Pemberton passed away 2 years ago, Your Grace. Mr. Davies has not been located. How convenient. Arthur's tone could have frozen fire. And Lady Viola's purpose in bringing this suit now, nearly 2 months after our marriage? What does she hope to achieve? Mr. Blackwell shifted uncomfortably. If the marriage is annulled, Your Grace, Miss Everleigh, or rather, Miss Jane, would revert to her previous legal status as an indentured servant. Lady Viola would have the right to reclaim her and enforce the terms of the indenture. Jane's stomach turned. Reclaim her, as if she were property to be retrieved. She wants to take me back, to punish me for escaping. More than that, Arthur said, his voice deadly calm. If our marriage is annulled, the debt I forgave would be reinstated. Lady Viola would once again owe the Avery estate £22,000, the fabricated sum I used to secure your hand. By reclaiming you as her indentured servant and invalidating the marriage contract, she eliminates both her financial obligation and her humiliation at seeing the orphan she despised elevated above her own daughters. The brilliance of the scheme was almost admirable in its cruelty. Lady Viola had found a way to undo everything: the marriage, the debt forgiveness, Jane's escape from servitude. One forged document to erase 2 months of happiness. There is more, Your Grace. Mr. Blackwell pulled another paper from his case. Lady Viola has also filed a separate petition claiming that as Miss Jane's legal guardian and holder of her indenture, she is entitled to claim any property or inheritance that would have passed to Miss Jane from her father's estate. She argues that the £5,000 loan your father made to Mr. Everleigh should be repaid from the assets Jane would have inherited, specifically a small property in Sussex that was held in trust until her 25th birthday. Arthur went very still. Jane has an inheritance? A property? I did not know, Jane said, her voice shaking. My father never mentioned. Lady Viola never said. Of course she did not. Arthur's hand clenched around the document hard enough to crumple it. She kept you in ignorance while she plotted to steal what was rightfully yours. Tell me, Mr. Blackwell, what is your role in this affair? Are you Lady Viola's solicitor? No, Your Grace. I represent the ecclesiastical court. I am merely delivering the petition as required by law. I have no personal stake in the matter. Then allow me to clarify something. Arthur's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. This document is a forgery. I would stake my reputation on it. The signature may superficially resemble my wife's hand, but if examined by an expert, I suspect it will prove to be a poor imitation. The witnesses are conveniently dead or unavailable. And the timing of this indenture creates a remarkably advantageous legal fiction for Lady Viola while being utterly inconsistent with the facts of Jane's residence in her household. Mr. Blackwell looked thoroughly miserable. Your Grace, I understand your position, but the court must examine the evidence presented. Lady Viola has also provided testimony from both your wife's stepsisters corroborating the claim that Miss Jane was indeed treated as an indentured servant during her time in their household. Of course they have. Jane's voice came out bitter. Constance and Beatrice would swear to anything their mother asked if it meant preserving their own positions. Arthur turned to her, and Jane saw controlled fury burning in his gray eyes. This will not stand. I will not allow her to take you. The law. Damn the law. Arthur's composure cracked, raw emotion bleeding through. I will not lose you to a forged document and the machinations of a woman whose cruelty knows no bounds. Do you understand me, Jane? I will burn every bridge, spend every penny, call in every favor I possess before I allow Lady Viola to reclaim you as property. Jane felt tears prick her eyes. Arthur. Mr. Blackwell, Arthur said, his attention snapping back to the solicitor with laser focus. You will inform the ecclesiastical court that the Duke of Avery formally contests this petition. I will retain the finest legal minds in England to examine every aspect of this supposed indenture. And I will personally ensure that if Lady Viola has indeed committed forgery and perjury in pursuit of this scheme, she faces the full legal consequences of her actions. Yes, Your Grace. Mr. Blackwell gathered his papers with obvious relief. The court will schedule a hearing within the month. You will be notified of the date. After the solicitor departed, Jane sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Arthur was beside her immediately, kneeling so that their eyes were level. We will fight this, he said fiercely, and we will win. What if we do not? What if the court believes her? What if they decide the indenture is valid and the marriage was illegal? Jane's voice broke. Arthur, I cannot go back to that house. I cannot be her servant again. I would rather... Stop! Arthur's hands framed her face with desperate tenderness. Do not finish that thought. You will not go back. I swear it on everything I hold sacred. You cannot promise that. The law? The law is a tool, and I know how to wield tools. Arthur's expression turned calculating, the strategic mind that had built empires from negotiations engaging fully. Lady Viola has made several critical errors. First, she has underestimated my resources and my willingness to deploy them. Second, she has assumed that forging a document will be sufficient, when in truth, forgery leaves traces that experts can detect. And third, his voice softened. She has assumed you are still the powerless orphan she once controlled. But you are not. You are the Duchess of Avery, and I protect what is mine. Jane leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his certainty, even as fear clawed at her throat. What do we do? We prepare for war. Arthur stood, pulling Jane to her feet with him. I will summon my solicitors from London. We will have that document examined by the finest handwriting experts available. We will locate Mr. Davies, the supposed witness, and determine whether he even exists or if Lady Viola fabricated him entirely. We will investigate the Sussex property and establish your rightful claim to it. And if necessary, his voice turned hard as steel, I will call upon every political ally I possess to ensure the ecclesiastical court understands that annulling this marriage would be an act of staggering stupidity. You would use your political influence to manipulate the court? I would use every weapon at my disposal to keep my wife. Arthur's gray eyes burned with intensity. I told you once that I'm not a good man. I meant it. I will bend rules, exploit connections, and leverage power without hesitation or remorse if it means protecting you from her. Does that shock you? Jane thought of the woman who had made her childhood a nightmare, who was even now plotting to drag her back into servitude. She thought of the 2 months she had spent at Thornfield, learning what it meant to be valued, cherished, loved. And she thought of Arthur, this complicated, fierce man who had fabricated a debt to secure her and would now move heaven and earth to keep her. No, she said quietly. It does not shock me. It makes me love you more. Arthur exhaled shakily and pulled her against him, holding her as if she might disappear. She will not take you. I promise you, Jane. Whatever it costs, whatever I must do, she will not take you. Jane clung to him, to his certainty and his strength. Outside the study windows, snow had begun to fall over Thornfield's ancient stones, blanketing the moors in white. Beautiful and cold and unforgiving. Lady Viola had thrown down the gauntlet. She had wagered that a forged document and legal maneuvering would be enough to reclaim the orphan she had lost to a duke's protection. But she had not accounted for the fact that the orphan was no longer alone. That she had found not just a husband, but a champion. That the Ice Duke would prove to have a core of molten fury when it came to defending what he loved. The battle for Jane's freedom had begun. And Arthur Wellesley, the 6th Duke of Avery, had never lost a war. The ecclesiastical court convened at the bishop's residence in York on a frozen January morning. Arthur had arranged for the hearing to take place in the Grand Assembly Hall, rather than private chambers, a calculated decision that Jane had questioned until he explained his strategy. Lady Viola thrives in shadows, he had said during the carriage ride north. She manipulates behind closed doors where only the powerful witness her schemes. We will drag this into the light and let society render its own judgment alongside the courts. Now, standing in the gallery, as nearly 200 members of the local gentry filed into the hall, Jane understood. This was not merely a legal proceeding. It was theater, and Arthur intended to command the stage. Lady Viola sat in the petitioners' section, flanked by Constance and Beatrice. all three dressed in mourning gray, as if Jane's elevation to Duchess had been a death in the family. Behind them sat the Earls of Asherton and Pembroke, lending their titles as silent endorsement of the petition. They looked confident, even smug, certain that law and forged documents would triumph over a marriage they had never deemed legitimate. The presiding judge, Bishop Harrington, took his seat at the elevated bench. He was an elderly man with sharp eyes that suggested he had presided over too many cases of human cruelty to be easily deceived. Beside him sat three ecclesiastical assessors and Arthur's own solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, no relation to the deceased witness, but coincidentally bearing the same name, which seemed almost providential. This court is convened to hear the petition of Lady Viola Everleigh regarding the alleged nullification of the marriage between His Grace Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Avery, and Miss Jane Everleigh, now styled the Duchess of Avery. Bishop Harrington's voice carried through the hall with practiced authority. Lady Viola, you may present your case. Lady Viola's solicitor, a weasel-faced man named Grimsby, stood and launched into a presentation that was equal parts legal argument and theatrical performance. He brandished the indenture document, described Jane's years of servitude in the Everleigh household, and painted a picture of a marriage contracted illegally by a young woman who lacked the legal capacity to consent. The law is clear, Grimsby concluded. An indentured servant cannot enter into contracts without the master's permission. The marriage is therefore void ab initio from the beginning. Miss Jane must be returned to Lady Viola to complete the terms of her lawful indenture, and all arrangements made on the assumption of this invalid marriage must be dissolved. Murmurs rippled through the assembled gentry. Jane felt her hands trembling and clasped them tightly in her lap. Arthur sat beside her, perfectly still, his expression giving away nothing. Your Grace, Bishop Harrington said, you may respond. Arthur stood with fluid grace, but he did not approach the bench. Instead, he addressed the room at large, his voice carrying to every corner with natural authority. My Lord Bishop, members of this court, ladies and gentlemen, we are here because Lady Viola Everleigh has produced a document claiming to establish an indenture that would invalidate my marriage to the woman I love. I could present expert testimony regarding the forgery, and make no mistake, this document is a forgery of the most transparent kind. I could produce evidence that the witnesses named on this indenture are either deceased or entirely fictitious. I could cite precedent and law, and argue technicalities until we are all gray with exhaustion. He paused, and Jane saw something shift in his expression, the strategic mask falling away to reveal raw emotion beneath. But I find I have no interest in such performances. Instead, I will tell you a simple truth. Arthur turned to face Jane directly, and she saw her own fear reflected in his eyes, along with something fiercer, absolute certainty. I will not allow this marriage to be annulled, not because of legal arguments or political influence, but because I love my wife. And I will not lose her to a woman whose cruelty knows no bounds and whose only claim to Jane is 12 years of systematic abuse. He moved toward Jane, and the entire hall held its breath. Lady Viola claims Jane was her indentured servant. Let me tell you what Jane actually was. She was an unpaid laborer, forced to serve the family that stole her inheritance. She was an orphan, stripped of her father's name and her mother's legacy. She was invisible, dismissed, treated as less than human by people who should have protected her. Arthur stopped directly in front of Jane's seat. His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her throat tighten. And then I saw her, at Carlton House, standing in the shadows while her stepsisters preened in the light. And I saw what everyone else had missed: dignity, strength, intelligence, and a capacity for grace under circumstances that would have broken lesser souls. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur lowered himself to one knee before her. The hall erupted in gasps. Jane's vision blurred with tears. Dukes did not kneel, not to anyone except the monarch. Certainly not to women they had married under questionable circumstances. But Arthur knelt before her now, in front of 200 witnesses and the ecclesiastical court. And when he spoke, his voice carried no trace of the Ice Duke's famous control. It was raw, vulnerable, utterly human. I kneel before you, Jane, not as a legal strategy or a theatrical gesture. I kneel because you are my equal in every way that matters. Because you have transformed my fortress into a home and my isolation into partnership. Because you see me not the duke or the title or the power, but the man beneath all that armor. And because I would rather spend the rest of my life fighting for the right to call you my wife than accept a single day without you. Tears streamed down Jane's face. She reached for his hands, gripping them tightly. Arthur's voice strengthened, addressing the court while never breaking eye contact with Jane. This woman is not an indentured servant. She is not property to be claimed or a contract to be voided. She is the Duchess of Avery, my partner, my love. And I will defend her place at my side with every resource I possess, every ally I can summon, and every breath in my body. He turned his head slightly toward Bishop Harrington, though his hands remained clasped in Jane's. My Lord Bishop, you asked for my response to this petition. Here it is. I reject absolutely Lady Viola's claim. Jane entered our marriage freely, as a woman of legal age and sound mind. Any suggestion that she was bound by an indenture that conveniently appeared only after our marriage is an obvious fabrication designed to steal what Lady Viola has always denied Jane: her freedom, her inheritance, and her right to determine her own future. Your Grace, Bishop Harrington said carefully, while your devotion is evident, the court must still examine the legal documentation, then examine it. Arthur's voice turned to steel. Have your experts analyze the signature, investigate the witnesses, question the timing. You will find what I have found, that this entire petition is built on lies from a woman who cannot tolerate seeing the girl she abused elevated beyond her reach. Mr. Pemberton stood, producing a leather portfolio. My Lord Bishop, if I may. We have indeed conducted such an analysis. Master Cartwright, the Crown's own handwriting expert, has examined the indenture signature and compared it to authenticated examples of the Duchess's handwriting from both before and after the alleged date of the document. His conclusion is unequivocal. The signature is a forgery, executed by someone with skill, but lacking access to adequate exemplars of Her Grace's true hand. He withdrew another document. Additionally, we have located Mr. Davies, the supposed witness. He is currently residing in Edinburgh and has provided a sworn affidavit stating that he has never met Lady Viola Everleigh, never witnessed any indenture agreement, and has not been in England during the year 1808. Chaos erupted. Lady Viola went white. Grimsby sputtered protests. Constance and Beatrice exchanged panicked glances. Bishop Harrington raised his hand for silence. Lady Viola, these are serious allegations. If you have knowingly presented a forged document to this court, it is not forged. Lady Viola's composure shattered. She rose, her voice shrill with desperation. That girl was my servant. I fed her, clothed her, gave her a roof over her head when she had nothing. She owes me everything, and she repays me by stealing a duke? By humiliating my daughters? She is nothing, do you understand? Nothing! A vicar's granddaughter playing at being a duchess. Arthur rose from his kneeling position with dangerous grace. She is everything. And you, madam, have just confessed to fraud before 200 witnesses. Bishop Harrington's voice cut through the tumult with absolute authority. This court finds the petition without merit. The indenture document is hereby declared a forgery. The marriage between the Duke of Avery and Jane Everleigh is valid and binding. Furthermore, Lady Viola Everleigh, you are charged with presenting false documents to an ecclesiastical court, forgery and perjury. You will surrender yourself to the magistrate for formal charges. Lady Viola collapsed back into her seat, all color draining from her face. Constance began to weep. Beatrice stared straight ahead in shock. But Jane saw none of it. She saw only Arthur, standing before her with such fierce protectiveness and love that her heart felt too large for her chest. "You knelt," she whispered. "I would kneel every day for the rest of my life, if it meant keeping you." Arthur's hand cupped her face with infinite tenderness. "You are not nothing, Jane. You are everything. And I will spend my life ensuring that you never doubt it again." Jane rose and threw her arms around him. Propriety be damned. Arthur caught her, holding her against him as applause began to ripple through the assembly, genuine, warm, approving. The local gentry had witnessed something they would speak of for years. The Ice Duke melting completely for the woman he loved. "It is finished," Arthur murmured against her hair. "She cannot touch you now. You are free." Free. The word settled over Jane like a benediction. Free from Lady Viola's cruelty. Free from the shadow of servitude. Free to be simply Jane, the Duchess of Avery, the woman who had transformed a fortress into a home and a duke into a husband. As they left the hall together, Arthur's arm firmly around her waist, Jane looked back once at Lady Viola. The woman who had made her childhood a nightmare now sat defeated, her schemes exposed, her power shattered. Constance and Beatrice would never visit Thornfield again. The Earls would distance themselves from the scandal. But Jane felt no triumph, only relief. She was done being defined by what had been done to her. She would be defined instead by what she chose. Partnership with a man who knelt before her, a home built on honesty, and a future that belonged entirely to them. "Take me home, Arthur," she said softly. "Always," he promised. And as their carriage rolled north toward Thornfield Abbey, the Duke and Duchess of Avery left the past behind and embraced the future they had fought so hard to secure. A future built not on fabricated debts or forged documents, but on something far more powerful. Love, freely given and freely protected. The orphan had become a duchess. The Ice Duke had learned to kneel, and together they had proven that the most powerful force in England was not titles or wealth or social position, but two people choosing each other against all odds. Real, true, irrevocably theirs. My lovely family, if you felt anything during that ending, if Arthur kneeling made your heart squeeze, if Jane's freedom made you emotional, if this story gave you even 10 minutes of escape from your day, I'm asking you to do 3 things before you close this video. 1. Subscribe, because I have dozens more stories like this waiting. 2. Like this video so YouTube shows it to others who need this emotional journey. And 3. Leave a comment telling me which chapter hit you hardest. Here's the truth. I can only keep creating these if you tell YouTube they matter. Right now, 8 out of 10 viewers watch for free and vanish. Don't be that person. Be the person who supports storytellers. Subscribe, like, comment. It takes 15 seconds and means I get to write Jane's next adventure. Thank you for being here. Now go share this with someone who needs a Duke of their own. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.